Welcome back. You're still watching The Globe on the SABC News Channel, and we focus our attention now on Sudan. But just a word of warning before we carry on. The following story does contain some graphic details which may be difficult for sensitive viewers to watch. The United Nations says that 440 civilians were killed last year in South Sudan's Tambura area in fighting between government forces and militias. In a report, the UN said that civilians were subjected to sexual violence and detained, and children were recruited into militia.
The report was compiled by the UN's peacekeeping mission in South Sudan and the UN Human Rights Office. The violence in Tambura in western Equatoria State occurred between June and September 2021. The report says some 80,000 people were forced to flee their homes to escape the fighting. It named members of the military, fighters from the Sudan's People Liberation Movement, and militias affiliated to them as being responsible for the human rights violations. The report added that they included high-ranking military officials, community and religious leaders. The UN's High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, called for those responsible to be held to account.
Well, for some reaction, we're now joined by Dr Jok Madut Jok, who's a professor of citizenship and public affairs at Syracuse University, and that's in New York State in America. Thanks very much indeed for joining us, and always good to talk to you.
Thank you, sir. Good to be back.
So this report, 440 civilians killed in fighting in southwestern and South Sudan in just a few months last year. That is an alarming fatality rate.
Absolutely. And despite the graphic nature of this violence, despite the disheartening suffering inflicted on the people of Western Equatoria, it was not surprising at all to read this report from the United Nations Peacekeeping Mission. Not surprising because it's not the first time these things have happened. The whole totality of the war, since it erupted in 2013, has resulted in more than 500,000 people dead in the course of the 8 years of that war. So this was not surprising at all, but it only goes to show the continuous nature of violence, the destruction of society and properties of people, and even more sad that it is happening on account of the activities of organizations such as the state military or opposition armies. People who are expected to protect these civilians are the ones who bear much of the responsibility for this.
So what does this tell us about the state of play in South Sudan? Some might say, hearing statistics like this and talking about this ongoing fighting, that we're actually looking perhaps at an almost failed state.
No question about it. I think even this report actually has elements in it that suggest that there has been a marked ratcheting down of violence in South Sudan. 440 in the course of 1 year of civil unrest is very small compared to what has happened in all other parts of the country. Some of it interethnic, others between militias, others between the government and the civilians. This is really, there is nothing more symbolic of the non-existence of a true state that has the fundamental responsibility of protecting citizens. So a failed state is measured by how much people suffer, sometimes at the behest of the state, but a lot of times because the state has failed to protect. And so you are right. You will be forgiven for thinking of South Sudan as a failed state.
So what has been the failure? I mean, we've had talks after talks, I remember being very excited when South Sudan's flag was raised. There was so much hope because the war between the North and the South had raged for so long, so many people had lost their lives, that this was supposed to be a new chapter. But in many ways, things have gotten worse.
Yes, in many ways it is a new chapter. At least the people of South Sudan have a place they call their own home. So there is definitely some kind of a compensation for all those lives lost in the struggle to be free. But the leadership of that country has fallen way short of the expectations and euphoria of the people upon attaining of independence. So where is the failure coming from? At this time, I think it is largely coming from the failure to implement the peace agreement. There was a peace agreement signed in 2015, 2016, that collapsed in 2016. Then there was a new peace agreement signed in Khartoum in 2018. And there has been interim period extension, and there is no end in sight as to when this agreement will be fully implemented. Most particularly the aspect of security arrangements in it, which is called Chapter 2 of that agreement, which was supposed to unify the government forces with the forces of the armed opposition groups that have signed the peace agreement. This did not happen. And so what you saw in Western Equatoria state is actually the failure of the security arrangements, in the sense that, in fact, while the government is responsible for these atrocities, the opposition army called SPLA in opposition has also been very, very front and center of the violence that has taken place in Western Equatoria. The reason being that these opposition armies have been using the civilians as a way to draw attention to themselves and to the issues that they are fighting for, which is the unification, cantonment and reunification. That has failed flagrantly. There is no question about it, that if the measure of a state is to keep people safe, then on this front, the failure has been the failure of the leadership of South Sudan to give meaning to the peace agreement they signed in 2018.
War is one thing, political differences is another, and maybe even fighting over it. But once it starts to become sexual violence, it's now terror. What is fueling the terror?
Well, in terms of sexual violence, and again, the report is very clear on how ghastly this thing is. This also is not surprising because it has been a key feature of the war, of the civil war within South Sudan, but also of the war between South and the North in those days. It's been a key feature, and people have asked this question: why? What is broken in a society to allow for these heinous acts to be meted out against women and girls, and in some occasions against boys? What is it that has allowed a society that used to have basic and fundamental ethos of war that never allowed people to engage in these acts? So that is the fundamental question. What is it that is different about the society in South Sudan today for acts of sexual nature, these crimes of sexual nature to take place? And I think the answer is in being able to look at how society has shifted from when women and children were at the center of social organizing, where whatever happens to the society, no matter how vicious the battle is, women and children have always been out of reach. But this has changed partly because women, in the same way that they are central, they are also seen as the moral guardians of society. They are the ones who hold the dignity of society on their shoulders, such that if two competing groups want to hurt each other, the most they can do to hurt the other is to go after women, because in that way you injure the dignity and the honor of your opponents by abusing their women.
What is it about the area of Tambura that it makes it such a hotspot?
Nothing very unique about it. And in fact, Western Equatoria, particularly Tambura and Yambio, the main cities of that state, have always been the harbingers of peace. Even during the war with Sudan, they were some of the earliest liberated areas and been run by SPLA over those years since 1987. But what happened is that when the peace agreement was signed, Tambura became one of the areas for cantonment of opposition armed groups, the IO. And the commander of these forces, who is a son of the area himself, was trying to use these ghastly means to suggest that there is no peace and that cantonment should be done quickly. And he was also targeting the local population, who are his own people, in order to entice them to his side, such that if they feel unprotected by the state, then the young people would flee to his side, therefore swelling the ranks of his militia. In case the reintegration of the militia forces comes, there will be more numerous of them. I think that is the logic behind this. But Western Equatoria is not unique in this. It is simply a site for contest and confrontation over the